Hi, my name is Colin Sandberg from the Endurance Collective, and I'm going to be talking about all the different forces and opposing forces that you experience when riding a bike. Now, I don't want this to turn into a physics lesson and get way into the weeds on that stuff, so I'm going to talk in generalities, and I'm going to try to go through this rather quickly because with any number of these subtopics, we could get really into the weeds here. But if you have questions or if something doesn't make sense, please leave your questions in the comments. So how fast you go on the bike is basically determined by how hard you're working, which is your power output, minus all these opposing forces. Aerodynamic drag, gravity, rolling resistance, drivetrain resistance, and braking force. Now I drew these arrows in different sizes, but they are not exactly proportional because it really depends on the specific individual rider and the specific circumstances. I put aerodynamic drag as the biggest because generally for a road cyclist on a flat road, that's the big one, and it's going to be a factor in pretty much any discipline of cycling, with the possible exception of indoor cycling. These forces all act in different ways, but generally, the faster you go, the more opposing force you have until you do hit a certain terminal velocity in pretty much any circumstance. And I'll go over the specifics later. The thing I want you to remember here is that if you want to go faster, it's really a very simple option. You have two choices. You can either increase your power or you can decrease the opposing forces. Now, the basic physics definition of power is work over time, or force times displacement over time. On the bike, there's really only one specific way that we generate power, and that's by rotating the pedals in a certain circumference of the circles that the cranks make. So force in this situation on a bike is represented by torque, which is basically angular force, how hard you're pushing on the pedals. And displacement over time is represented by cadence, or RPM, revolutions per minute, which is how fast you're spinning. So basically, you want to increase power, you can either push harder, increase the torque, or you can spin faster, increase your RPM. Now there's one thing I do want to mention about the work being done here. This is external work. This is power producing work that you are doing, not the work that your body is doing, which is actually much greater, and it includes a lot of other things because your body has to keep all your organs alive, keep oxygen and blood flowing to your organs and brain, and a lot of energy is used just keeping yourself cool. It's also important to remember that pedaling is not 100% efficient, so you have forces that are in other directions. Imagine if at the very bottom of your pedal stroke pushing straight down, or even working against yourself when you're pedaling. Your left leg is pushing down, your right leg might be pushing backward just because of the weight of your leg, working actually against the power producing. So even the most efficient cyclists in the most efficient circumstances are only about 25% efficient. Meaning 1 out of every 4 calories of energy actually goes into producing power on the bike. Something else to note here is that power only drives the bike in one direction on the bike, so it's moving the bike forward, with the one exception of if you were on a fixed gear bike or a track bike and you back pedal, it can create force in the opposite direction. Now I said on the last slide, if you want to go faster, you can either increase your power or decrease the opposing forces. Focusing on power, you can either push harder or spin faster. Cycling is unlike most endurance sports in that it is generally a very non-steady state, less paced sport. Compare that to, say, if you're a middle distance or long distance runner, the goal is to set out on the pace that you can maintain for the duration of the event. That's not true with cycling for the most part. It's a little bit more true with time trialing, but certainly in any mass start event, if I'm sitting in the pack, I should almost all of the time be able to go harder, but I don't want to because I want to save my energy for when I really need to go hard, when it counts, in the critical sections. Maybe that's a sprint, maybe that's the decisive climb, maybe that's an attack that gets me in the breakaway, maybe it's a technical section where I need to get to the front. So, but that is essentially what, when we talk about tactics and strategy, that's what it's about. It's about the choice of when you want to use your power and how to use it. Like I said, time trialing, it's a little bit more like distance running, but because there's definitely a pacing aspect like running, but there are still some choices that you have to make about when it's going to be more worthwhile to use your power and work harder. So let's look at aerodynamic drag. In terms of aerodynamic drag, if we're in a time trial or just riding by ourselves, not drafting, there are two main categories that we can look at to reduce aerodynamic drag. One is to make ourselves smaller. If it's a smaller profile, less aerodynamic drag. If we reduce our surface area, either by getting lower on the bike, lowering our head, going into a super tuck, these things all reduce the surface area, and so we reduce aerodynamic drag, the amount of air that we're having to push forward. And then the other category, and this is a little bit harder to measure, is slipperiness, how the air flows around us. Sometimes this stuff is counterintuitive, and I'm not going to get into the details here because it's really difficult to even quantify a lot of this stuff without going to a wind tunnel. But things like aero helmets or aero wheels or shoe covers, they're not reducing frontal area, but they're helping the air flow around us and our bike better. But a lot of it really does depend on how the different parts of the system, meaning the rider, the bike, the wheels, and your clothing, all your other equipment that you're carrying with you, interacts. And that's different for everybody. So that is why going to a wind tunnel can give you something that you can't get just by sort of checking off your list of aero improvements. So let's look at rolling resistance. Rolling resistance is the friction of the tires and the surface you're riding on. It's going to be affected by the quality of the surface. It's going to be affected by your speed. It's going to be affected by how hard you're pushing. Everybody knows that if there is not much, if you're not getting good traction, your tire is more likely to slip in a smaller gear. It's going to be affected by your tire width, the material, the tread of the tire, and the pressure. Now, a lot of that comes down to how much rubber surface is meeting the surface of the road or the dirt or whatever you're riding on. So that's going to be affected by a lot of things. But there's also some more subtle things like the type of rubber and how fast it rebounds when it hits something. The other thing is the tire and tube type, and what I mean by that is, are you riding tubulars or tubeless or clincher tires? And the tube type, meaning is it a butyl tube or is it a latex tube? Those things affect rolling resistance too. And of course the weight of the rider and your equipment. A lot of that affects how much surface area of rubber is hitting the ground because of how much weight is on the system. Now for a road rider riding on a smooth road, rolling resistance is generally thought of something that is fairly a small fraction of the overall opposing force. But as the surface gets not as good, the calculus changes a lot. So if you want to visualize this picture, you're riding along at 20 miles per hour on a smooth road, and then you jump into off the road onto the dirt or the grass and keep riding at 20 miles per hour, it gets a lot harder really quickly. And the only thing really that's changed there is the rolling resistance has dramatically increased. So obviously, when we're talking about mountain biking or cyclocross or gravel, any off-road events, this is going to be a very significant factor. But even on the road, it can be significant, especially when we're talking about unpaved sections or poorly paved sections. Now, we all know that choosing the right tires, the tire width, the tire type, and pressure makes a big difference here. But when you make those selections, there's also some trade-offs. So you have to factor in the weight of the tire, because wider tires, you can run them at relatively lower pressures and generally have lower rolling resistance because there's more contact area. But since they're heavier tires, and since that's rotating weight, meaning you have to keep accelerating it. If you remember your physics, something rotating in a circle is continuously accelerating. That rotating weight is a little bit more important than the weight of like your body and the frame, for example. It's also important to realize in terms of trade-offs that certain tire types may have a lower rolling resistance but higher chance of flatting. Or they might not handle as well under certain conditions like rain or mud or loose surfaces. Okay, now let's talk about gravity, and you'll notice that the arrow here is perpendicular to the ground because it's important to keep in mind that gravity pulls you towards the center of the earth. It doesn't directly oppose the force of motion, your forward motion. This really is the most consistently overrated of the forces. But it is affected by how heavy you are, mass of the rider and your equipment. And the big one here is the incline, what the incline of the surface you're riding over is. Now, there's I said this is overrated, and I think a lot of that has to do with the classic correlation versus causation problem. Heavier riders, bigger riders, are generally less aero. That aerodynamic change is, as a general rule, going to be much more a factor than the added weight. Yes, weight is a factor, especially on hills. It is also a factor when you have to accelerate, because it's more work to accelerate a higher weight than a lower weight. When you talk about having to, let's say you slow down going through a turn, you have to re-accelerate. It's more work if you're heavier. So it is a factor there, even on a flat road. In general, I would say gravity overrated. Now, you'll notice that I mentioned rolling resistance in the last slide before gravity, and that's because your weight, the weight of all your equipment, does affect rolling resistance, and that's why the ideal tire pressure for a 100-pound person is different from the ideal tire pressure for a 200-pound person. I would say, I think one of the other reasons, other than the correlation versus causation issue, that we tend to overrate gravity and weight as a factor is because it's easy to measure. It's a lot easier to measure the weight of your bike, the weight of your body, than it is the aerodynamic profile or rolling resistance or any of these other things. As I mentioned briefly, rotating weight before, the weight of the wheel and the tire is rotating weight, which is constantly accelerating. So if there is one place that weight reduction is a little bit more important, it's going to be in the rims and tires, because it's constantly accelerating. And to a lesser degree, the weight of your pedals and shoes, because those are rotating as the cranks rotate. So you're having to constantly lift that up over and over again. Now, if you picture riding along a flat road and the road starts to get steeper and steeper and turn uphill, the calculus does change, and there is a certain point where gravity will become the dominant opposing force. Also, because aerodynamics are less of a factor, the slower you go, those uphill sections can be decisive moments, because you can't, and are likely to be decisive moments in races, because there really isn't anywhere to hide like you can on the flat roads, flat sections. But I think that before you start to make too much out of this one side, it's important to really look at the percentage of a given course, of a given event that might be uphill. And it's often very, very small. And if we look at the ways that we can become lighter, either by reducing our food intake or dehydrating ourselves, or making our bike and equipment lighter, there's a trade-off a lot of the time, either in our ability to train and stay healthy and perform well, or on the bike side in terms of performance of the bike. And it's often a lot of sacrifice for a very marginal gain. Okay, let's look at drivetrain resistance. This also is generally thought to be a small one, but can end up being significant, especially if things aren't working properly, if you've got a lot of dirt or crud in your drivetrain. Now, one thing I will mention here is I'm talking about the bearings, all of the bearings that are moving in your wheels, pedals, bottom bracket, derailleur pulleys, as well as the friction between the chain, your cassette, and chain rings. Now, strictly speaking, the wheel bearings are not in your drivetrain, but I am including that in here. So like I said, it's going to be affected by how clean those moving parts are, how worn out and old they are. Also, the type of chain lube and the lube you might use in the bearings are. It's going to be affected by the angle of the chain, because if you're cross-chained, that's going to cause additional friction in the links of the chain. And also, if you look at the derailleur pulleys, it's a tighter angle and a little bit more friction there. If you're in a smaller gear, like an 11 or 10 tooth cog, it's a tighter angle of the chain, it's going to be more friction. And that, by the way, is why oversized pulleys can reduce a little bit of the drivetrain resistance, because they make that angle greater. The chain is not bent quite as tight. A lot of one other thing to mention here is that a lot of people now use single chain rings, especially in off-road applications, and that may reduce the weight, it may decrease the incidence of technical issues, and it may also allow, especially when we're talking about full suspension mountain bikes, to give you some more advanced rear suspension designs. But it also may mean that you have to increase that angle of the chain, you have to cross chain, and you may need to use like a 10 tooth cog to get the gear range you need. So that's all going to increase your drivetrain resistance. So something to bring into the calculus when you make those decisions, whether to go 1x or 2x. And braking force, again, something that a lot of people don't think of, but it can really add up, especially when we're talking about courses that are very technical. Cyclocross is a great example, because there's often a huge difference if you look at the better bike handlers and the worst bike handlers, and look at how much energy is lost braking. Now, one thing here that's really critical to remember is that every time you brake, when you go through a turn or some sort of obstacle on the course, it requires more power to reaccelerate, which of course is more important. It's a lot greater than the power it takes just to remain at a certain speed when we're talking about accelerating. So the overall energy use can be really much greater when you apply the brakes, let's say, more liberally. But the answer is not always to brake less, because in addition to not crashing and staying safe, braking well, using your brakes properly, can also allow you to stay on the right wheel in a pack or to take a better line, so that the energy you lose braking may in a lot of cases be worth it for the aerodynamic or rolling resistance benefit. Okay, now I want to mention a couple things about indoor cycling here. I could do this for every single discipline, but I'm not going to do that. The reason I'm focusing on indoor cycling is because I think it's something that people have not examined yet. It's a relatively new sport. And just to clarify, I am talking about competitive indoor cycling here, as opposed to indoor cycling just as a training method. In many ways, it's really very simple, because you are not moving. Aerodynamics are not important. You're not moving, so there is no aerodynamic drag. And also, weight is not important because you're not moving. You're not fighting against gravity at all, and you don't brake indoors, so braking force is not significant. The only two things that are significant are how much power you're putting out and the rolling and drivetrain resistance. Now, rolling resistance is going to be basically there is resistance on a wheel-on trainer. There is resistance against that tire. On a direct drive trainer, it's really against your chains. So strictly speaking, you could count that as drivetrain resistance. I'm calling that rolling resistance because it's fighting against the motion of your chain. And then there's also a little bit of drivetrain resistance, which I have in another category, which would be, the regular friction between your bottom bracket, derailleur pulleys, your pedal bearings, and so forth. But not any friction in the wheels in a direct drive trainer. There would be friction in the wheel bearings of a wheel-on trainer. And of course, there are internal bearings in any trainer that are going to cause a little bit of friction. So obviously, if you're racing on a virtual reality cycling platform like Zwift, you're going to program in your height and weight, and you're going to choose a virtual bike, and you're going to ride certain courses. Those are all going to have formulas or algorithms for how much resistance it's going to give you and factor in, but it's a fixed calculation, so it doesn't change like in the real world. And this is what's important to remember, because in the real world you can really change a lot of these things on a moment-to-moment basis. If I'm riding along and I go from the hoods to the drops, I change my aerodynamic profile, and even weight can change. As I ride on a hot day, I get dehydrated, my weight changes. And there's in-game calculation, obviously, whether you're drafting, whether you ride on, there's different surfaces that will have different calculated rolling resistance, but that's not generally something you can change by the way you ride, like in the real world, where I can choose one line or the other that might be a little bit smoother, or to ride behind one rider who might be a little bit bigger. I think one thing that is kind of relatively untapped in the virtual reality cycling world is designing setups that are really specifically for indoor events, which is a different calculus than other applications, than other disciplines of the sport. So just like a mountain bike looks different from a road bike, looks different from a gravel bike, looks different from a track bike, because all the calculuses are different. Really, an indoor racing setup could look very different too, because you don't need to think about aerodynamics on the bike. So if you've got a position where you can produce more power more efficiently, that's going to be better. Aerodynamics are just calculated on the platform. Weight doesn't matter. Safety and bike handling don't really matter, because you're fixed. So I really think, you know, if you had something like one of the bikes, like the kicker bike or the stages bike or the tax bike, that's going to be a heavy bike that doesn't flex but also has a relatively sealed drivetrain, you might have some marginal gains. And lastly, speaking of marginal gains, even with your regular bike on the trainer, I think if you're looking at some changes that might give you relatively marginal gains, such as oversized derailleur pulleys or waxing your chain, these are things that could be very expensive and may not provide a whole lot of gain on the road. But for an indoor application where your bike isn't getting very dirty, you might, and a lot of these other forces are not present, they're going to be a higher percentage of the force. And so some of these marginal gains might, for a lot of people, they might end up being, you might decide that they're worth it. All right, enough about indoor cycling. Okay, so conclusions, notes here. Important thing to always remember is that cycling is as much about saving energy as using energy. So it's not just the training side, it is looking at how to save energy, how to reduce these opposing forces. But most of those force reductions come with trade-offs, and I'll talk about that a little bit, I think, on the next slide. But it's very, very important to know the specific demands of your discipline. The power profile, meaning what type of power, because it's not just about how much power you can sustain for a given amount of time, which would be like FTP. But you know, so training to have a high FTP is different from how you train like for a criterium or a cyclocross race where you need to make a bunch of bursts, a very non-steady state application. You need to look at the length of the efforts you'll need to make, how many efforts you need to make, how long they are, and at what point. You know, do you have to make a hard effort at the beginning or in the middle or at the end, or all of those. And as is the point with this presentation, you have to look at what are the significant opposing forces. It's important to realize that just reducing the opposing forces isn't always that helpful. It's not always significant. And that's where it's important to know the specifics of your event. If we look at road racing, a lot of it is just saving a little bit of energy here and there, being as efficient as possible, because there's usually critical moments that you will get to, and most people are going to be tired by that point. So it's not about the ability to make those when you're totally fresh, it's about the ability to make them when you're tired. You look at cyclocross, rolling resistance becomes very significant in terms of how you choose the lines as well as the braking forces. If you look at time trialing or triathlon cycling, because it's a paced effort, a lot of these incremental gains can really add up and reduce your overall time in a way that they might not necessarily in other mass start applications. We look at mountain biking. Rolling resistance, obviously important. Braking, very important. Aero, less important. That's why mountain bikes are generally more upright, but it is not completely unimportant. Talked about indoor cycling, aero not important at all, position not important at all, the weight of the bike is not important at all, but drivetrain improvements could be significant. So, I'm sure what a lot of people want to know, is there such a thing as free speed? And there's really very few categories of improvements that you can make. Things that there are things that take a lot of time. There are things that cost a lot of money, and there are things that come with sizable trade-offs. And then there's a few things here that you can do pretty much freely. So pay attention to these. First of all, just keeping your drivetrain clean. People talk about these marginal gains like oversized pulleys, wax chains and stuff, but all of that is going to be insignificant if your chain and cassette and chain rings are worn out, or if they're really dirty, or if they're not lubed properly. So just keeping everything clean, it is relatively easy to do, and it makes a big difference. And it's free speed. Wearing form-fitting clothing. You have to have clothing. Make sure it fits. Wearing baggy clothes creates a lot of extra aerodynamic drag. And you can get crazy with this in terms of speed suits or even skin suits. Some of those do come with trade-offs because they may not be as comfortable, or they may be really expensive, or they may be hotter than regular clothes, or they may not have pockets. So you need to keep that in mind. But at the very least, make sure your clothing fits. Make sure it's form-fitting and it's not flapping around. Third, inflate your tires appropriately. A lot of this is counterintuitive, so I'm not going to go into the details, but let's say, I would say the old school, at least on the road, is really like tires that are too narrow and inflated too high. The recommendations are going to be based on the type of surface you're riding on, the width of your tires, the weight of you and your equipment. So a lot of different things factor in, but there's a great guide on the Silca website. You can either Google Silca tire pressure calculator, or you can go to this link here, and it gives you some good recommendations there. Fourth, get a good bike fit. A bike fit's going to take a lot of things into consideration: power production, efficiency, aerodynamics, bike handling, safety, all of these things. And at a certain point you get to, you're at a very high level with all of those things, and to get any further might involve some sort of sacrifice. But I can tell you, as a bike fitter myself, most of the bike fits that I do, I'm able to increase all of these things, or at least not have any trade-offs. I can, most of the time, make people more aerodynamic and increase power output and efficiency, and make them more comfortable and make their bikes fit better. There's a lot of people who are not really fit properly on their bikes, and it's not until you get into the extremes where you have to look at, okay, I can put you in a more aerodynamic position, but it's going to cost you power and so forth. Next, work on bike handling. It can really pay off, and I think for many people it is low-hanging fruit. It's going to make you safer, it's going to make your bike handle better, and it's going to make you go faster and save energy. Following the right wheels is kind of along the same lines. Finding riders who are not only good drafts, but good bike handlers. Following somebody who's a good bike handler is going to help you pick lines better, so it's going to decrease your rolling resistance. It's also probably going to reduce your braking force, because a better bike handler is going to be steadier. You're not going to have to hit your brakes and then reaccelerate over and over again. And that can really add up, not to mention more safe. And finally, replace your worn out parts. Know how to look for worn out tires, check your bearings, your chain, your cassette, any of these moving parts. It's important, more important than having the top of the line tires and ceramic bearings and a Dura-Ace chain and cassette and speed suit, is make sure that it's in good shape, that it's working well. And if you're wondering why I included clothing here, it's because clothing that wears out gets more baggy, and it's also not going to be as comfortable and more likely to cause things like saddle sores. Okay, last slide, and this is really the one that is tricky is finding your individual limiters. The thing that's important to keep in mind here is it's not just about going faster at any moment. It is about getting to the finish line faster. So certain things you could, most of the time, in most races, you can go faster on a moment-to-moment basis. That doesn't necessarily get you to the finish line faster. You know, if I ride a little bit faster than everybody on the hill, that doesn't necessarily get me to the finish line faster unless I'm able to, you know, time trial away or get in a breakaway and maintain that. Just going harder may mean actually at a lot of given points on the course may actually mean I get to the finish line later than other people. Then there's also things like, you know, most of the time sitting in a pack, aerodynamics, you're well sheltered, so it's not as important. Rolling resistance, drivetrain resistance might only be a small percentage of the forces. So we could be talking about the difference between, you know, pedaling, let's say at an endurance pace, or pedaling still at an endurance pace, power, but 20 watts less, because some of these opposing forces are a little bit less. That's not necessarily significant. Maybe it helps in terms of being able to save a little bit more energy, but it's not necessarily going to be decisive. Like I said, most of the time in any given race, you're not going as hard as you can. Certain things, like I mentioned, time trials, it's going to be, you know, if you can go a little bit faster without sacrificing anything else, without sacrificing power production or anything, then yeah, maybe it will get you to the finish line faster, and maybe even a couple seconds may be really significant. But you have to look at the specific event, and you have to look also, and this is the one that is, I think, a little bit more difficult to figure out. You have to look at your individual strengths and weaknesses. I think that can be really hard. I'm a big believer, of course, as a coach, that working with a coach can help you do this, because it's hard to see ourselves objectively. But either way, what I would do is I would suggest looking at things not by comparing yourself to other riders, but sort of the best version of yourself. In other words, you want to look where there's the most room for improvement in areas that are significant to the discipline or disciplines that you care about. For example, if we're talking about aerodynamics, if you're a large rider, you're probably always going to be in the upper percentiles of aerodynamic drag. So you're never going to be able to get as aero as somebody who's, you know, 5'2" if you're 6'4". But you have to look at how aero you are compared to sort of the most aero version of yourself, at least the one that is the most aero without compromising power and efficiency and bike handling and safety and so forth. And same thing with all of these things. We make improvements, but the more we improve, the more marginal those gains get. And maybe those are significant in certain people, in certain types of events, and in others it can just be a waste of time and money. So most of these improvements do come with trade-offs, either a decrease in power, a decrease in efficiency. Maybe it's going to make your bike handling not as good. Maybe it's going to make your health not as good. You know, if we're talking about trying to lose a lot of weight or dehydrate yourself to reduce the gravitational force, then you're risking your health. And of course, you know, time to train, or time to maintain your bike, or to get used to a certain position, and money, the money that a lot of these things cost. So thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to this channel, and like I said at the beginning, if there's anything that I have said that doesn't make sense, or you'd like clarification or further detail on, I'd be happy to answer that either in the comments section or in a separate video. Thanks for watching.